Welcome to the Tudor Dixon podcast. Today we are going to be talking missionaries. And I know that's something that we don't get to talk about every day, but on Sunday I was at church and this amazing guy was at church talking about his life story and an organization called Josiah Venture. And it really resonated with me. This is a gentleman who had the call to be a missionary. He's a second generation missionary. He had the call to Central and Eastern Europe. And as I was listening to the story, I'm like, man, not only, the Bible is timely, but not only is this timely when it comes to faith and the rising faith in the United States, but also with everything that's going on the world stage. So I'm glad that Dave Patty agreed to join me today on the podcast. Dave, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be with you.
I'm so excited. So I want to go a little bit through Josiah Venture because I was listening to your story on Sunday and I'm like, I don't know how you know. And I thought it was interesting because you said you just felt this moment where you're like, I'm being called to go to Central and Eastern Europe. And you talked to your wife about it and she's like, I love that you're being called. Not sure I am.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I was involved in my first experience in Central and Eastern Europe was right after communism fell. So if you can imagine 6 months from the time the wall fell, I was in Budapest in a high school talking to Hungarian young people about God, which would have 6 months earlier been just absolutely illegal. And I came home from that trip with just this huge burden on my heart for a whole region of the world that had just opened to freedom, just come out from communism and had been under incredible oppression. So every year for the next couple of years, we did these short-term trips into the region, but we had small kids, so my wife never went with me. And then there was a spot when the Soviet Union started coming apart that I heard someone speak and they said, we're at a hinge of history. This kind of change only happens in a region once in a generation. Then you imagine the number of countries that came free during that time. And they said, it's important for us to just make as much progress as possible in rebuilding these countries and rebuilding the spiritual foundations of these countries. So I came home and said to my wife, I think God is calling us to Central and Eastern Europe. And she did not respond very enthusiastically, if you can imagine.
You grew up as a missionary. Your parents were missionaries. You said you came back when you were 5, but you had to have grown up with that knowledge and understanding. Was that her background as well?
No, that wasn't her background. She grew up in Oregon, and her dad was a salesman. So I had more of that ethos in my personality. And I guess even from when I was about 12 years old, my dream was to be involved overseas in countries in hard places and dark places where I had the opportunity to tell people about God and teach the Bible in those places.
Hard places and dark places. And sometimes I feel like we are in that situation here, but you went someplace that is considered an atheist country. But tell me about that moment, because I think that I always think it's fascinating to hear about that moment when God lays something on someone's heart and they're unsuspecting and it hits them very hard. And that happened for your wife, right?
It really did, yeah. So sometimes when we talk about, God's call, where does that come from? And sometimes it comes from seeing a need and just sensing you want to respond and dreaming about how God could maybe use you to make a difference. And then there's sometimes where it's almost like a supernatural moment. I really believe that God speaks to us in different ways, and there are times he just grabs us. And so we were talking about this move, and it created so much tension in our marriage that I finally told my wife, we're not going to talk about it, because I said, I'll just pray. And if this call is from God, that he'll change your heart. And her response was, oh, good, this is over. We're not going to move to Central and Eastern Europe. And then something really strange happened. It was over Christmas, and we had given our young kids to her parents to take care of. And we got a couple of nights away. And at that time, there were the tryouts for the Olympics were on TV. And the Romanian gymnasts, which if you remember, the Romanian gymnasts were amazing. Mm-hmm. They were on, and I walked out of the room to go down the hall to get a bucket of ice and came back in and just noticed my wife just staring at the TV. And she turned and she said, now, what did you mean about Central and Eastern Europe and young people. And I just set down my eyes. I said,
And you're
oh,
like, here
something's
it
just
is.
happened. Oh, no. And then I said, why? And she said, well, I was just looking at those Romanian young girls, and I thought, I could love them the same as I've loved American teenagers. And something changed in my heart. And something did in just a moment. And it was amazing that God changed her heart. She said, I think I'm ready to go. So in 1993, we moved with our young family. This is not long after the revolution, into a corner of the Czech Republic. And we felt like we moved to the end of the world. Now there's ends of the world that are much more desolate than that, but everything was gray. We were the only Americans in a broad area. It felt like everything was just covered as a layer of soot, including the people. You would never see someone smile. They wouldn't catch your eyes. If you greeted someone on the street, they thought you were about ready to rob them because you never talked to a stranger. And I remember my wife going into the store for the first time that the best stores were like low grade much worse than a 7-Eleven. And she came back home and she said, I don't know how I'm going to feed this family. I don't know where I'm going to buy things. So it was a huge step of faith for us to make that move.
But it hasn't been easy. And that's the thing that I loved about what you said on Sunday. It's like, this has been a challenge the whole time. And I'm like, how do you do that? Because I think it's so easy, especially now in the United States, because we are a spoiled society. When it gets very hard, we're like, okay, let me find something else. But you guys have stayed. You created Josiah Venture. You had a vision. The vision was a movement of God among the youth of Central and Eastern Europe that finds its home in the local church and transforms society. And that's a big vision, because there wasn't that much of a local church there. But you knew going to the young people was the answer.
Yeah, well, Czech Republic is the most atheist country on earth. And so I remember I started teaching in the high school, and I asked my students, do you believe even in the existence of God? And there was only one student in a class of 30 that even believed God exists. Now, this is not even someone who has active faith in God. So we were really moving to what we felt is a very different area. But we had this vision, and part of it was, as you look at these countries, they were trying to rebuild economically, they were trying to rebuild educationally, but you've got to rebuild the soul of nations as well. And if you don't have spiritual foundations in a nation, really, most of the other things don't work. I remember reading a quote from Václav Havel, who was the first president of the Czech Republic, and he said, the worst thing is that we live in a contaminated moral environment. We fell morally ill because we became used to saying something different than what we thought. Concepts such as love, friendship, compassion, humility, or forgiveness lost their depth or dimension. And so it was really interesting that the first president was saying, we have a soul crisis in our nation. That's really where things come from. And so we had this vision to be part of rebuilding these nations by rebuilding the spiritual foundations of young people, and basically helping local churches reach young people and create communities of young people that are centered around the Bible and around faith in Jesus Christ. And we felt like that would change countries. Now, that was a big vision. We just had 4 people in 1993. And we moved in. I remember thinking, there is no way this is going to make any difference. No way anything's going to happen for this. Our church had a youth group of 5 people, and the youngest was 23 and the oldest was 71 in our little small youth group. And we were in a town of 100. Yeah, we were in a town of 100,000. I went, how in the world are we going to make any difference here? So it was slow and tough in the beginning, in those early days.
So I love the fact that you had these kind of miracle moments where there have been leaders who've said there's a crisis here, and have kind of let you fill in those spaces, because there certainly were doors open that didn't have to be opened in your story. I think what was most interesting to me was your story in church started with a video of a young man named Pavel. And it was so powerful to me to see him, because we saw him as like a 13-year-old, and then he was a young adult. And at 13, he said, I was angry and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what to do with my anger, but I went to this place. And what struck me about what he said was, I saw these people that had this sense about them that I wanted to be like them. And I think that's the joy of Christ. I think what he saw was the joy of Christ, and to have somebody who is in a culture, as you said, that is beaten down. The people have been beaten down. Communism has taken over the region. Everybody is depressed. There's been a lot of war. They are now hungry. Everything's gray. You set the scene very well for what the community is. And it's almost like those, the way my mind's eye sees it is those videos where everybody's in like a dark and dingy scene. It's almost black and white. And then they walk into a room and it's filled with a rainbow of colors. It's almost like that's what his soul felt when he walked in there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. You were saying Pavel, and he's one of thousands of young people who've come to faith in Jesus Christ through our work in local churches there. And it's so interesting because I love lighting a match in a dark place because you really see it and you really see the difference. And we've just, when you think of someone who has no faith in their background. He didn't have a single relative in his extended family who believed in God or had any connection with church. And so, and when I think, coming from a Christian background, I think, what would it be like if that was missing in my life? If life was just going to work, making money, retiring, and dying, and I didn't have any higher meaning, or the spiritual dimension of my life was just empty because I had no relationship with God. I can't imagine what life would be like. And yet so many of those young people, they don't even, one of the things when I asked in my class, do you believe in God? All of them said, I'm an atheist. And I would ask why. And they couldn't tell me why. They were cultural atheists, which is really interesting. And they'd never met someone who had living faith. And I remember one of the teachers, we had a teachers meeting, and she leaned over and she said, I was the first Christian teacher in the history of this school, right in the very beginning. And she leaned over and she said, I always thought that Christians were either really weak, so they needed a crutch, or very old. And she said, you seem to be pretty smart and you're young. Why in the world do you believe in God? And so that was kind of the background. But then when you saw young people come to faith in Christ, it's like you said, the lights came on, changed every aspect of their life, changed their sense of hope, their sense of meaning, their purpose, how they approached, like what Pavel said. He said God removed anger from his life, gave him different relationships. So it's pretty exciting for us to see that kind of transformation happen in really thousands of young people.
And one of the interesting,
go ahead.
One of the interesting openings that I think you had is you mentioned that people said, well, if you're teaching English, my parents will let me come because they believe that that's the key to so many more opportunities. So here you are in the United States, you get this call, you get to go there and use your language, your life, what you know, to reform an entire country's youth.
Yeah, it was, I didn't expect that. And that's one of the things about when you're following God's call. He often has a lot of plans that you don't know anything about, and he opens them up as you go. I was learning Czech, and I speak fluent Czech. I thought it's breaking the rules to use English and when you're working overseas. But I found that all the young people, that's their ticket to the world is English. So we began teaching English and then did an English camp. And then all of a sudden, the young people from that camp were interested in joining this little youth group in our church, which all of a sudden became a youth group of about 60 with a bunch of young people. And we really found these camps were one of the keys to drawing in young people and exposing them to a community of believers and to what it means to have faith in Christ, because they would come to learn English and we would teach them English, but we would also talk to them about what it meant to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And so we did one camp that first year in 1994, 3 the next. Since then, we've done 2,000 week-long camps in partnership with local churches across the region with over 120,000 young people. So that was, what started just with 4 people in the beginning has blossomed. And that's just one of the ways that we use to reach young people through camps. We also go into schools. We have a whole music ministry, a sports ministry. But it's really about how do we gather young people into healthy communities that are very different than what they've experienced before. And then over time, they begin to learn about faith in God and what a relationship with Jesus Christ can do to really transform your life.
So over 100,000 in a country of how many?
Well, actually, that's in more countries than just Czech. Okay. But we also, I don't know how many it's been in Czech. It's It's a lot in Czech, but we also have been face to face with over 150,000 people in schools. There's a lot. We were able to do a TV program on Czech television so all kinds of doors open to really
Talk
begin
about
to
that
change
because
the
I thought that
society.
was fascinating because
Yeah,
that's that moment where there is almost a government push to bring culture back. And I think that there's something here that we kind of want to touch on is that the Czech Republic is very into preserving what the Czech Republic is. They don't allow immigration. They're very cautious
that's
about
right.
who they let
Yeah.
into the country. The culture is important, but in that, I feel like when you were talking about that, it seemed like, wow, that was a moment where the country said, we need a healing, we need hope. This man is bringing hope. They saw you as bringing hope to their country, and they're very particular about what they let in.
Yeah, they certainly are. Yeah, they're very competent, very proud people. They're very capable, and they aren't easily manipulated. They're pretty strong. So what happened was we were working with young people, and we had an intern, and one of them we had the graduation for our interns, and I met this intern's father, and I said, "What do you do?" And he says, "I produce television shows for Czech television." And I said, "What's your dream for the future?" He says, "I wish there was a way that we could have some kind of spiritual content on TV, because there's none of that. They're not getting anything about something that would build a moral foundation." And I said, "Yeah, wouldn't it be great if there was a Christian show for young people on TV?" And he looked at me and he said, "You're not serious, are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm serious. It's a great idea, but something like that's not possible." And he said, "Well, would you pray about it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." He said, "And if the door opens, would you do it with me?" I said, "Yeah, maybe." And so about 6 weeks later, he said, "I've just contacted Czech television. They actually are concerned about the moral slide among young people, and they're open to doing a Christian show. And they said, if you will produce it, they'll air it for free." And so then we asked, "Well, how many do they want?" And they said, we did a pilot, and they said, "Why don't you do 17 episodes?" So we began to broadcast on national TV a show called Exit 316, which is just basically stories of young people's lives who've been changed by Christ and changed by learning how to live like the Bible tells them to live. And we just would tell these stories on national TV. Well, it was going so well that they said, "Why don't you do another 13 episodes?" And then they said, "Do another 15 episodes." And we aired twice a week on national TV in the most atheist country on earth, stories of young people's lives who've been changed by Christ. So that was pretty exciting, and it was reaching hundreds of thousands of people every week. So I became the producer of a TV show in the Czech Republic, and I don't have any TV background. But then they said, "Would you do it again?" So we broadcast twice a week on national TV for 2 full years in the Czech Republic, and it just was changing the whole moral environment of the country to hear those stories.
And I love that because it's young people sharing their story. You put
That's
together
right.
young people's stories so that they could reach out to other young people. Now there's been kind of this phenomenon of TikTok. And so I
That's
wanted
right.
to talk
Yeah.
about that because you talked about these young TikTok ministers, and we complain about TikTok so much because of the content that is crazy and taking kids in bad directions. But there is a lot of faith content out there, and you're finding that people in Eastern Europe are able to use it to reach hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, that's right. So if I, fast forward to today, I started about their story in 1993. It was just two couples. Now we're working in 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So I live in the Czech Republic, but we have staff in 16 countries. We have 380 full-time staff, and we're working with, we'll train about 7,000 young leaders in a typical year. So what we try to do, the reason for our name Josiah Venture is because Josiah was a king in the Bible who was a young king, and he followed some really bad kings before him. But he charted a different direction. He really brought his nation back to God, and it changed the whole nation. And he did it as a young person. And so we said, how do we find the young Josiahs? Those young influencers who will influence in a different direction, will influence by their faith in God and influence their generation for Christ, because we feel like they can make changes in the entire country. And so we're always looking for those young people. that are making a difference. Well, one of those is in Serbia. His name is Alexa, and he had a radical experience with God as a 15-year-old, and really came to faith in Christ. Started reading the Bible. It totally changed his life. And then he looked at all his friends, and they went, they're on these all the time, but there's no one who's giving any different message. So he propped up his phone on an orange. He had an old Android phone and put it on an orange and recorded one TikTok, just talking about his faith in God, and put it away. 5 views, 6 views, 8 views. And then he went, this doesn't make any difference. Came back a couple days later, and it had blown up because another famous TikToker in the nation had absolutely made fun of him, but it drew everyone's attention to his TikTok. And so they started watching him. So
it's funny
he started
how God
posting,
works.
Yeah. He started posting TikToks every day. And these are straight up. He talks about how, here's what the Bible says about this issue. And this is why faith in Jesus Christ will change your life. Just totally straightforward. This young, now he's 17 years old, Serbian guy, but he has regularly his TikToks will reach 500,000 people.
Jeez.
So if you can imagine this young 17-year-old who just is boldly proclaiming a message that's very different than what's normally out there on TikTok.
Is
and
that
he's got
dangerous
500,000.
in that area?
It can be, because some people, the Serbians are pretty hot-blooded, and but I think they're also curious about part of it is when you get a young person's voice, it's different. They're not quite as threatening. There's a vulnerability to it, but he's regularly reaching 500,000 people, and in a country also that doesn't have a strong church. Few
I love
believers
this
in
story
Christ.
because we keep hearing that Christianity is losing ground. And I don't think that we have been, my dad used to always tell me, advertise your progress because nobody else cares unless you're telling them what you're doing. And
That's
I
right.
don't think we do that enough in the Christian world, is to advertise our progress. And I know that, we have a big Arab American community in the state of Michigan, and in the Muslim community, they are strong about advertising their progress. And so I think a lot of Christians feel like, oh, we're kind of falling behind. And when I hear these stories, that's why when you were at church, I was hearing these stories. And I'm like, we need to share this, because for those of us who this matters deeply to, it's important to know that there is progress being done, and that people like you have created something from 4 people to go to over 300 people across multiple different countries. That's an amazing feat. And there is God's fingerprints on every part of this, but it hasn't been easy. I think that's the one thing that you said. The wind of spiritual opposition is constant where you are. And yet you stay doing it. So tell us a little bit about what the opposition is like.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things has been, my family's been sick most of the time we've been there, and with crazy things that you wouldn't expect. It's not like we live in the jungle where you would catch malaria or something like that, but it felt like every time we would head into something new, my wife would get sick or my kids would get sick. I stayed healthy most of the time, but then also there's opposition. I've had my life threatened by parents whose kids come to faith in God, and they they're afraid of what that's going to be, and have threatened our lives in that. But then the other thing is there just is a sense of darkness, and I think that's true in the United States too. But in areas of the world where there's small faith in God, you actually feel it. You sometimes just feel that you're pushing into a headwind. The darkness of discouragement and hopelessness really presses in on you. And so we've been at this for 31 years, but it's not easy. We just keep going.
So in the time that you've been there, suddenly you have this war break out in Ukraine, which is right next door to where you live. And you took a turn in your ministry to provide relief to Ukraine. And that was something that you, again, didn't have any history with, but God provided. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this is one of the amazing things about serving God and the call of God is, again, He has plans that we don't know about, and I always feel like we get invited into His work, and it's always surprising to see what He has. So we have 27 staff in Ukraine, and also staff in all the countries around it. And so when the war broke out, we were deeply affected because the refugees were pouring into the countries where we live in, and pouring from the country that that this war was happening in. And so some of our staff evacuated in the first couple of days, and then we went, wait, we've got to help with this. And so we strategized, and within 5 days we were sending aid. We found that the border was a very difficult place because men couldn't leave, but they would come and just drop off their wives and kids at the borders, and sometimes stand there in the middle of winter for 3 or 4 days, then try to get across.
Days.
Then they don't. Yeah, days. And with young kids in a plastic bag of everything that they owned. And then they'd get across the border and then try to figure out where they were headed next. They didn't speak the language. So within 5 days, we began sending tour buses across the border to pick up refugees and bringing them back, and then connecting them with local churches in the countries surrounding them. So we were taking them into the hands of believers who would care for them and really cared about them. And we brought 51 buses of people across the border, and then we would send them back filled with aid. Now, we're not an aid organization, we're a youth ministry organization, but we had to pivot, and within 5 days, we basically reorganized our whole team around helping the situation. But the advantage we had over large aid organizations is we know the people everywhere. And so we could pick up a phone and call this pastor or contact this person. And so we were able to get aid right to the place where it needed the most. We'd get a phone call from someone on the front lines, and they'd say, we need diapers. And we could have them to them in 1 day. We became the largest buyer of kind of the Costco version in the Czech Republic. And within in a period of a year, we were able to provide $7 million of aid to Ukraine. And we're not an aid organization; we're a youth ministry organization. But we were just channeling that to people, and we're still very engaged there. We're not doing as much aid right now, but actually, I talked to our team this morning, and they're getting ready for their summer of ministry. One of the staff, she's a 23-year-old and lives in Irpin, which you've seen on the news. And I just talked to her about what it's like to be there right now. But one of the things that maybe you don't hear about is believers are really stepping forward, and the church is making a huge difference in Ukraine right now. And she said last Sunday they had the anniversary of their church in Irpin, and she said 1,000 people were there.
Wow.
And,
wow, that's amazing.
And she said the church is making such a difference in that area. And we'll do 37 camps with young people, with Ukrainian young people this summer, all the way from the front lines. And there'll be several thousand Ukrainian young people in camps that we're leading this summer in these next couple of weeks.
As you were telling this, when I was listening to this on Sunday, I was just thinking, God knows everything. He already saw that before it happened.
That's
he
right.
knew that was where you needed to be, and he knew this war would happen. And you tell such a different story of the war than we know, because we know the higher level negotiations. But when you said that men, I mean, it brings a tear to my eye. When you said that men are dropping their wives and children at the border, when we hear the people in government in the United States saying, we want the killing to stop. We don't want to lose 5,000 men a day. This is crazy.
Oh, yeah.
We've got to stop this. I think about how many of those people were dropped off in the cold for 3 days and never saw that man again.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it brings a lot of emotion to me as well when you hear that. Just the impact on the families. We need to pray and do everything we can to bring this war to an end. It's impacting people every day. So when I talk to our staff, they say, yeah, every night we just hear explosions, all through the night, and they're right out there in the midst of it. Two of our team members. Well, one of our team members was driving. He's a man in his mid-20s with his wife and 1.5-year-old kid. He gets stopped at a police checkpoint and pulled into the Army. Because they have to get the men out there to defend the country. So his wife is left. She doesn't have a driver's license, and all of a sudden she's left in the car alone with her 1.5-year-old child, and her husband's gone for the foreseeable future. She doesn't know if she'll even see him again. These are men on our staff that are now serving in the military. Another one was just walking down the streets of the town and got stopped and pulled and couldn't even go back to his apartment building. So there's both the death and destruction, but there's also the ripping of families and the sense in these young families of, will I ever see my dad again? So as we're working with the young people, many of them, their fathers are gone. They're fatherless homes. and they don't know even if they're going to get pulled into the military. So really, caring for the soul of that young generation in Ukraine is crucially important. So we've got 7 churches that are right on the border, right on the front lines, and they're pastors who've stayed there, and they're youth groups. Youth group is the only place where young people can gather together because their school is all online and all the communities are shut down. And there are these pastors who are shepherding these young people right on the front lines. And we'll do 7 camps with them. And they just said, get us as far away from the noise of the bombardment as possible. So we're taking them into the mountains in the far west and going to give them a week of camp together and create community, but also talk about a hope that's bigger than just this life, and a hope that's rooted in a relationship with God that is independent of what's going to happen politically. That you have a foundation that's deeper than just the circumstances around you.
I mean, truly, truly amazing work that you're doing. I just want to, before we close, you are 2nd generation, but you've raised a 3rd. You're wondering what's going to happen with the 4th, but your kids are also missionaries, correct?
That's right. My kids are missionaries, and so we're in 3rd generation missionaries. So I have a son that serves in Albania, another son that serves in Czech, and a daughter in Germany, in the eastern portion of Germany. So yeah, it's into 3rd generation, and maybe we'll raise a 4th.
So tell everybody, I know as they've listened to this about Josiah Venture and everything that you're doing, I know there's a lot of people out there that will want to help out. So tell us where they can go to find out more about it, how they can contribute to what you're doing over in Eastern and Central Europe.
Yeah, you could. We have a website, www.josiahventure, and it's not Josiah Adventure, it's Josiah Venture. So think of the name, the King Josiah, and then just venture.com. And there you can see our different teams. You can go in and search one of the countries. You can see all our Ukraine staff. There's different projects there. But one of the things I would just say is if our strength is in our national staff, is in our Ukrainians, our Poles, our Czechs, our young leaders who are really serving on the front lines. And if any of your listeners wanted to just adopt one of those young people that are making a big difference, you'll see all their pictures on our website, or you could write me a note through our website and just be a part of what God's doing there, which is really exciting.
That's amazing. I love it. I love your story. I love what you're doing. And I'm so glad you came on to share it today. Dave Patty, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much as well.
And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon podcast for this episode and others. Go to the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can watch the video on Rumble at Tudor Dixon. But make sure you join us next time and have a blessed day.